If you could stand where I stood before we begin, I want you to do something simple. Close your eyes and picture a city of pale limestone rising from dry hills, Jerusalem, where every street feels like a corridor of history, and every shadow belongs to a religion, a kingdom, or an army. Now imagine that you and I are living there in the late 12th century, during the reign of a king who is both famous and tragic, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the Leper King. People tell his story like a legend. Courage against impossible odds, a sick young man wearing a crown too heavy for any healthy adult. But when you live inside that world, it isn't legend. It is dust, sweat, parchment, prayer, and fear. It is politics carried in whispers through cloisters. It is steel ringing at dawn in a valley that smells of wild thyme and horse. It is the sea wind on the road to Jaffa and the furnace heat of the Jordan Valley. It is the certainty that every harvest, every caravan, every marriage alliance might tip the balance between survival and collapse. So let me take you there, properly, not as a fantasy, not as a postcard, but as a lived record. I'll tell you what I saw. The places, the campaigns, the terrain, the fortresses, the people who moved the levers of power, and the way Baldwin's illness shaped everything, even when nobody dared say it aloud. And as you listen, keep this in mind. I'm not asking you to admire the past. I'm asking you to stand inside it with me, so close you can hear the prayers echo off stone and the war drums roll from the horizon. Quick note, before we ride out, if you're not subscribed to my channel yet, subscribe now, and please like this video. It's the simplest way to tell the algorithm you want more historical storytelling like this, and it's what keeps this series alive. If you want the next chapter after this saga, we genuinely need your support. Now, come with me. Chapter 1. Jerusalem under a boy. King's Shadow. If you had met Baldwin IV in the streets, you might not have recognized him at first. People expect a king to fill a doorway, to dominate a room by sheer health. But Baldwin's authority was stranger than that. It came from composure, almost a stillness, and from the way everyone around him moved as if the floor might crack. I arrived in Jerusalem as a junior scribe attached to the Latin chancery, one of those quiet workers who copies letters, tallies supplies, and translates the endless practical business of holding a kingdom together. From the beginning, you would have felt the city like a machine made of stone and faith. The streets near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were crowded with pilgrims, Armenian merchants, Syrian Christians, and Latin knights in bright cloth over mail. The smell was incense and tallow, but also garlic, livestock, and human breath. This was not a museum. This was a living capital with a nervous heartbeat. From the city walls, I learned the geography that decides everything here. Jerusalem sits high in the Judean hills, defensible, yes, but thirsty. Water is life. Cisterns are strategy. Look west, and you understand the coastal plain, flatter, faster, and vulnerable to raids. Look east, and the land drops toward the Jordan Valley, where the air thickens and the heat turns cruel. Travel a day, and the world changes from pine-scented ridges to sun-blasted salt lands. And always, always, the kingdom is shaped by roads. You would have ridden them with me, down to Jaffa, where sea-wet air hits you like a blessing, north toward Nablus and the orchards, further into Galilee, where fields roll and the horizon feels open enough to invite cavalry, and southeast toward the Dead Sea, where the earth looks scorched, almost lunar. Every route has a purpose, to move grain, to move pilgrims, to move reinforcements, to move news. News is the true currency in Baldwin's reign. In the palace and in the hospitaler and templar quarters, I heard the names that mattered. Raymond of Tripoli, a powerful prince-regent figure in a kingdom that often needed regents. The ambitious men clustering around the royal family, the orders, templars, and hospitallers, who were not just monks with swords, but permanent institutions with fortresses, treasuries, and their own chain of command. And then there was the larger shadow, Saladin. You felt him even when he was far away, not as a myth, but as a map problem. His power centered in Egypt and Syria, two engines that, if properly connected, could squeeze Jerusalem like a fist. Every council meeting circled the same questions. Which border castle is weakest? Which lord is unreliable? Which caravan route can be disrupted? Which ally can be bought? Baldwin, even young, understood something you would have admired. A kingdom like this survives by being quicker than its enemy expects. Not necessarily stronger, quicker. He rode when riding hurt. He attended councils when fatigue hollowed him out. His illness was not a private tragedy. It was a strategic factor everyone calculated around. We didn't talk about it openly, but you would notice the details. The way servants hovered, the way a glove might stay on longer than necessary, the way he moved his hands carefully as if negotiating with pain. And yet, when he spoke, the room leaned in. The first time I truly understood the stakes was not in the throne room. It was outside the walls, among supply wagons. You learn very fast that the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem is not held by speeches. It is held by bread, horseshoes, arrows, and water skins, by the dull, relentless physics of logistics in harsh terrain. And those logistics were about to be tested in blood. Chapter 2. The Road to Montgisard and the Shock of Victory. If you want to understand Crusader warfare in Baldwin's time, forget the romantic image of a single decisive charge. Think of movement, scouting, routes, timing, and the constant fear of being caught where the land betrays you. The year the kingdom's nerves snapped, we heard it first as a rumor. Saladin was moving, and he was moving confidently. His forces could travel fast, and they knew how to exploit the open country, especially the coastal plain, where cavalry can sweep like a tide. You would have ridden with me out of Jerusalem with the army assembling in uneasy layers. Knights with mail and conical helmets, sergeants and footmen carrying spears, crossbowmen whose slow, brutal bolts could punch through armor at terrifying angles. Clergy, because war here is always wrapped in prayer. And the orders, disciplined, severe, and hard as hammered iron. We marched toward the west, toward the flatter lands where the air tastes of salt and grass rather than stone dust. Near the coast, your sense of distance changes. Horizons widen, and so does danger. It is easier for an enemy to appear without warning and harder to hide your own movements. At Montgisard, the world turned into one of those moments historians argue about for centuries. But I don't remember it as a battle. I remember the feeling before it happened, that terrible clarity where you know you are either about to die or about to become a story. Saladin's army was larger. Everyone knew it. Their confidence showed in their movement, in how they spread, and yet Baldwin chose to strike when they did not expect it. That is the key, not bravery alone, timing. I watched the king ride out despite his condition, and you would have felt something tighten in your throat because you'd realize what it means for a sick young monarch to put himself where arrows fall. There was a religious energy to it, yes, banners, relics, prayers shouted into wind, but there was also a cold, professional calculation. If we waited, we would be surrounded. If we struck, we might fracture them before they could fully form. The charge, when it came, was not clean. It was noise and impact, horses screaming, men losing formation and trying to rebuild it while everything moved. But the effect was astonishing. Saladin's force was caught in an awkward posture, and panic travels faster than discipline when the ground is wrong and the surprise is sharp. You would have seen the battlefield not as a chessboard, but as a mess of micro-events. A knight's lance splintering, a line of infantry buckling, crossbowmen stepping forward, loosing, stepping back. Dust so thick it turned sunlight into a dirty veil. The shouts were in multiple languages, French, Latin, Arabic, layered like competing prayers. And then slowly, the realization spread, we were winning. Victories like that are not joy at first, they are disbelief. Your mind keeps waiting for the trap. Only later does the weight of it land on you, that a smaller kingdom, led by a sick king, just punched a giant in the mouth and lived. Back in Jerusalem, bells and hymns filled the streets, but even in celebration there was anxiety, because everyone understood the deeper truth. Saladin would learn. He would adapt. A victory can harden an enemy as much as it encourages you. And Baldwin's illness did not pause for our triumph. If anything, the pace of war demanded more from him than his body could afford. That's when politics began to feel like a second battlefield, one fought in corridors instead of valleys. Chapter 3. Fortresses, Fractures, and the Long Squeeze. If you stayed with me into the next years, you would notice the kingdom's geography becoming more militarized by the month. Not in a dramatic way, but in an infrastructural way. More patrols, more repairs, more messengers, more watchfires. This is the era when fortresses stop being background scenery and become characters. We traveled north, where the land rises into cooler ridges and greener valleys, and you could sense why Galilee mattered. Food, manpower, and routes connecting to the wider Levant. We passed strongholds that controlled movement like hands on a throat. Castles were not just walls, they were statements. They said, this road is taxed, this valley is watched, this pass is denied. Further east, the Jordan Valley felt like a different planet. The descent from the highlands is steep, the air grows heavy and hot. Water becomes a strategic obsession again. Any army moving there is constrained by thirst, by heat, by the limited lines of approach. A commander who understands terrain can win without a glorious battle. I remember visiting frontier positions where men looked older than their years. You learn to recognize the 1,000-yard stare of a soldier who has watched dust on the horizon and wondered whether it was traitors or death. And inside the court, the fractures widened. Baldwin's health worsened, and that meant the succession question, always poisonous, became urgent. Lords and factions formed around potential heirs and marriage alliances. You would have heard names repeated with coded emphasis, as if the way someone pronounced a noble's title was itself a political move. There were arguments over regencies, over who should command armies, over which foreign alliances could be trusted, Byzantine influence to the north and east, the shifting interests of neighboring Crusader states, the uneasy realities of diplomacy that never matches the sermons. Meanwhile, Saladin pressed steadily, not always with full invasion, often with raids, pressure, and targeted destruction. He understood something brutal. If you can make the countryside unsafe, you starve the city without laying siege, burn crops, threaten caravans, force peasants to flee behind walls, and the kingdom's economic arteries start to clot. One of the most haunting journeys we took was toward the great desert-leaning fortresses east of the Dead Sea, Kerak country, where stone castles rise from harsh landscapes like the bones of giants. The wind there is sharp and dry, and when you look out from a battlement, the distance feels endless. It is beautiful in a merciless way. At Kerak, during the later crisis years, I saw what siege pressure does to a place. Not merely the exchange of arrows and stones, but the psychology, the constant vigilance, the rationing, the quiet dread of hearing engines being assembled. You realize that medieval war is as much waiting as fighting, waiting for relief, for supplies, for a mistake you can exploit, or a disaster you cannot prevent. Baldwin's presence in these years was paradoxical, sometimes physically absent, but politically everywhere. His condition made him a symbol, both rallying point and vulnerability. Every enemy calculation included it, every internal argument leaned on it, and yet the kingdom did not collapse while he lived. That is the fact that still amazes me when I look back. Baldwin's reign was not a neat story of heroism. It was a prolonged act of statecraft under physical deterioration, holding together lords, orders, and cities that each had their own priorities. If you were with me, you would start to feel the future approaching like weather, inevitable, heavy, and not entirely predictable. The question was no longer, will there be war? It was, when will the next blow land and where? Chapter 4, The king fades, the horizon darkens. There is a particular kind of silence that comes when a leader is dying and everyone knows it. In Jerusalem, it showed itself in small changes, more private meetings, more urgent letters sealed and dispatched, more guarded conversations in cloisters and courtyards. Even the city's sounds seemed different, less celebratory, more watchful. By then, I had seen enough to recognize patterns. When Baldwin's health declined sharply, military decisions became more contested. Commanders argued over whether to risk the field or cling to fortifications. Noble factions maneuvered more aggressively because the future crown meant everything: land, authority, and survival. You would have felt the kingdom's strategic dilemma tighten. If you concentrate forces to meet Saladin, you risk leaving frontier zones exposed. If you spread out to defend everything, you risk being defeated in detail. If you avoid battle too long, morale and credibility erode. Lords begin acting like independent kings. And on top of all that, the landscape never stops being an adversary. Summer heat that exhausts men and animals. Winter rains that turn roads into mud and slow everything. Mountain passes that can save you or trap you. Coastal winds that make camp life miserable and disease more likely. Every decision is made under these constraints. I remember one evening on the walls, looking out as the sun dropped behind the western hills and thinking how small Jerusalem looked from a distance, how fragile. Inside the walls were churches and palaces, markets and prayers. Outside were roots and enemies, alliances and betrayals, harvests and drought. When Baldwin appeared in public in those final years, it carried a gravity I can't fully put into modern words. It wasn't just that he was a king, it was that he embodied the kingdom's defiance, proof that for a time will could overcome weakness. but even will has limits. The day it became clear that Baldwin's reign was nearing its end, you could sense a shift in everyone's posture. The orders tightened discipline, nobles sharpened their plans. Clergy spoke with an edge of urgency, as if prayer itself needed to be louder to be heard. What I want you to understand, what makes this period so compelling, is that the tragedy wasn't only Baldwin's illness. It was that the kingdom's survival depended on a delicate balance of personalities and power structures that could not easily outlive him. When Baldwin finally faded from the center of events, it felt like a lamp being lowered, not extinguished at once, but dimmed enough that shadows grew longer. The horizon did not instantly fill with enemy banners, but the direction of history became clearer. Saladin's pressure, the kingdom's internal factionalism, the unavoidable arithmetic of resources and manpower, these were forces that didn't care about individual courage. And yet, if you ask me what I remember most vividly, it isn't only fear. It's the intensity of life in a place where history is not something you read. It is something you endure. I remember the sound of hooves on stone leaving Jerusalem at dawn, the taste of dusty water from a skin that had been warmed by the sun, the sight of a fortress rising above a valley like an argument made in limestone, the moment in battle when the world narrows to breath and balance. The way people prayed, not because it was beautiful, but because it was necessary. If you had lived it with me, you would have come away with one hard-earned truth. Baldwin IV's era was not a simple tale of crusaders and sultans. It was a human struggle conducted across real terrain, hills, deserts, coasts, rivers, where politics and war were inseparable, and where one young king's determination delayed an outcome that geography and power were slowly arranging. That delay, those years bought by stubbornness, strategy, and sacrifice, is the reason we still speak his name. Closing, before you go, if you made it to the end, subscribe to the channel and like the video. It truly helps more than you think, and it's what lets me keep turning deeply researched, documentary-style storytelling into full series. If you want more chapters like this, more voices from inside history, your support is how we keep going.